Welcome, everyone, to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies. In today's episode, we are joined by Norman to discuss Proletarian Internationalism. We have had some requests to do more historical content, and so we thought what better guest than Norman, who's a historian, to bring on and discuss this. So, Norman, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Norman Markowitz. I have taught at Rutgers University as a historian since 1971. In terms of what this program is about and what our movement is about, I came to Livingston College of Rutgers University, which was a new college founded out of the struggles of the 1960s, at a time when Rutgers had few Black students and gender segregated colleges, with Rutgers College as a men's college and Douglas College as a women's college. The college I was at was a new college. There were many progressive, radical, Marxist, anarchist, and other teachers there, and a student body that was 25% African American and about 10% Puerto Rican. And it was an exciting place. It represented a new and more dynamic kind of education. Unfortunately, when the great upsurge of the 1960s ended in the mid-1970s, that school was merged with the larger Rutgers University, and I've been teaching history there as a Marxist scholar and an active member of the CPUSA since 1978. And we've been through many, many struggles. In recent years, there's been a new upsurge, led also by a revived version of the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. And this has encouraged in universities, faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, to participate in heightened struggles. And right now at Rutgers, let me conclude by saying we have taken a strike vote, and there is a good possibility we will see that Rutgers University, where I teach, will be on strike. A possibility. Okay, thank you, Kyle.
Wow, that's interesting to hear that there's a little bit of an uptick in interest in Marxism and in just the broader socialist kind of ideology in general at the universities.
Yes, and that's a major reason why rightist governments in states like where, unfortunately, you are, Texas and Florida and other states, have been seeking actively to suppress Black history and also related topics.
Yes. Yeah, we do see the kind of the right-wing war on education and war on teaching history.
Yes.
And so it's very important that there are comrades like you that are in these university systems that are teaching history. I mean, what better place? I know, and I think I was telling you before we started this, that one of my first really introductions to socialism was from a college history professor.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, the right-wing talking point is that the university systems are indoctrinating our youth into Marxism, and I wish that were true. I wish there was more.
Okay, well, Sigmund Freud used the concept of projection. Essentially, what the right wing wants to do is indoctrinate the entire population, but all students, in an American exceptionalist glorification of American history as the history of a glorious capitalist individualist society. That's what they want, and they project onto those who are critical of them what they themselves are trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to the question of war between nations.
Yeah.
And what the Marxist and communist definitions of working class or proletarian internationalism are. And so do you want to give a little background of this topic and kind of what we'll be talking about today?
Oh, yeah. I was going to start by looking at the beginning, namely the thinking of Karl Marx from the Communist Manifesto on the Marx's development of a concept of proletarian internationalism during the Civil War, at a time that the International Working Men's Association, known as the First International was established.
Mhm.
Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chain. You have a world to win. These words from the manifesto, which was published roughly at the time of the revolutions of 1848 broke out, were among the most famous words anyone came forward with in modern history. The revolutions were defeated. Marx went into exile and would spend the rest of his life in exile in London, the center of great industrial, capitalist, and imperialist power in the world. In the 1850s and 1860s, Marx also, with the help of his colleague and comrade Friedrich Engels, engaged in not only organizing, not only studying in the British Museum, which was the leading library in England, the work that his studies would later become the basis for the fully developed theory that became Marxism. But he also wrote on politics, on international relations for a number of publications, but particularly a pro-abolitionist newspaper in New York, the New York Tribune. And there he wrote critical of the British Empire's opium wars, Britain's opium wars against China. He did not defend the feudal Chinese empire, but he wrote powerfully against Britain's identification of freedom and progress with the doctrine of free trade, in this case, the right to sell opium to the Chinese people. He also wrote about Britain's suppression of the Indian uprising in what was their largest colony, and the largest colony in the world, India, at the time, in 1857. And he wrote, again, not sympathetic to the feudal system that existed in India, the princes, the Maharajas, et cetera, but there he saw what Britain was doing was to create the beginnings of an infrastructure for themselves, creating misery and suffering, but an infrastructure that could possibly, or would in the future be the basis for, once the Indian people had freed themselves through a revolutionary transformation, a society that would produce real freedom. He said so powerfully that until there was a great revolution that would claim the resources that were being created by this dislocating and this destruction of the existing civilization and society, progress would continue only, and he mentioned an old god that would drink from the blood of the slave. Okay, the Civil War begins. Marx, from the beginning, defines the Civil War, the American Civil War, as a revolutionary civil. He, in 1861, when many British liberals were critical of Lincoln's refusal to abolish slavery, and the British government under Lord Palmerston was moving in the direction of supporting the Confederacy, he rallied support for the Union, writing that those British liberals who were critical of Lincoln and refusing to support the American Republic because Lincoln had not abolished slavery, these were the same people who had been horrified at John Brown's attempt to launch a guerrilla war against slavery. And they had been very clear in their statements that it was better to maintain slavery than to have a revolution against it. Okay, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Marx wrote this: "So far we have witnessed the first act of the Civil War, the constitutional waging of war. The second act, the revolutionary waging of war, is at hand. The First International actively supported Lincoln's re-election, and Marx, writing for the First International, the International Working Men's Association, sent this letter in January of 1865 to Lincoln. And it's an important letter, and it's regarded as an important letter in world history. We congratulate the American people on your re-election by a large majority. If the resistance to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your second re-election is death to slavery. And while the working men of the North, I go on, the true political powers of the North allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. In short, Marx comes forward with the concept of proletarian internationalism. This revolutionary civil war, this war of classes, of slaveholders against working class supported capitalists, was necessary for the greater freedom of the working classes of the whole world. This barrier to progress had been swept away by the Red Sea of civil war. Marx had been inspired by the fact that the British textile workers, who had been hurt very badly by the Union Army's blockade, cotton blockade, and cotton was hugely important to the textile industry, and it was hugely important to British industry, that these workers had not succumbed to the argument of British capitalists and British supporters of breaking the blockade, using the British Navy to break the blockade, and thus aid the Confederacy, even though they had suffered from this blockade. They remained strongly and staunchly loyal to the Union and staunchly anti-slavery. Marx's final comment, the working men of Europe feel sure, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the, quote, middle class, meaning the bourgeoisie, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an example of the epoch, these are the old words, that it came to fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class. Lincoln was an elected president. He was, even though he'd become a lawyer and he'd been successful, he had come from the working classes to lead his country through this matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world. In short, Lincoln saw this war as a revolution, or not Lincoln, but Marx and the First International saw this war as a revolutionary war that deserved the support of the working people of the world internationally. Okay, shall I go? Yeah.
So this was one that, during this context, just to back up a little bit, at the time, who was the working class when this was going on
in the United States?
In the United States, yeah. Who was
in the United States? Industrialization had begun. There was a developing industrial working class. Marx saw the Southern slaveholders, by their economic and social policies, blocking the development of industrial capitalism, which was true. He also saw and who were these workers? They were artisans, people called mechanics. They were people producing goods for themselves and selling those goods. They were also, in growing numbers, miners, railroad workers, factory workers. This was the beginning of rapid industrialization. And they were also, farmers were important too.
Mm-hmm. And so this was a war that Marx and the First International did publicly support the Union.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No, I think it's important to point that out, and to point out that when we talk about internationalism today, and we talk about the peace movement, and we're talking about how we should be opposed to war between nations, but this one is interesting because in this case this was a barrier, like you said.
A barrier to progress, a barrier to development. It is, even though this is a civil war, and we'll see later when we look at another civil war, the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, this is a civil war with revolutionary and counter-revolutionary possibilities. And as such, it is more of a war in a direct way than the later Franco-Prussian War, which Marx and the International Workingmen's Association would actively oppose, which I'll talk about in a minute or so, represented. And there you began to see the general position. If you want, I can quote from, and this is also very famous, from Marx's inaugural address to the International Working Men's Association, which sums up the position of the First International, and a position that would continue through the period of the mass socialist parties, the Second International, and be then revised and enriched by Lenin with the development of the communist wing of the socialist movement. Okay, so if you don't mind, I can read this statement and then we'll go forward.
Yes.
Okay, first, if the emancipation of the working class requires their fraternal, he used the word concurrence, how are they to fulfill this great mission with a foreign policy in pursuit of criminal desire, playing upon the national prejudices and squandering in pirate wars the people's blood and treasure? And here he goes on to look at, it was not the wisdom of the ruling class, but the heroic resistance of their criminal folly by the working classes of England that saved the West of Europe from plunging headlong into an infamous crusade for the perpetuation and propagation of slavery on the other side of the Atlantic. Then he says, and this is a little bit because there had been conflicts, and the First International actively supported the independence of Poland from the Tsarist Russian Empire. And Marx saw in his lifetime the Tsarist Russian Empire the way in my lifetime people through the world have come to see the United States as the great and destructive power of imperialism. Marx saw, and others saw, the Tsarist Russian Empire, even though it was semi-feudal, backward, infamous for its military power, as the, quote, gendarme or policeman of Europe, just as many people throughout the world today see the United States as the policeman of the world. Still, Marx then wrote heroic Poland being assassinated, the shameless approval, mock sympathy, or idiotic indifference of the upper classes of Europe to heroic Poland being assassinated by Russia. What should the working classes of the world do? These actions have taught the working classes the duty to master themselves the mysteries of international politics, to watch the diplomatic acts of their respective governments, to counteract them, if necessary, by all means in their power, and when unable to prevent, combine in simultaneous denunciations to vindicate the simple laws of or morals and justice, which ought to govern the relationship of people as the rules that are paramount to the intercourse of nations. The fight for such a foreign policy, a policy of actively opposing war, forms a general part of the struggle for the emancipation of the working class. And subsequently, the International Working Men's Association, which Marx played a leading role, but also combined anarchists and other reformists, radicals, etc., would actively oppose the Franco-Prussian War. And here, Napoleon III, who Marx called the Little Napoleon, who during the American Civil War, as many Americans should know, had used the American Civil War to establish a, quote, puppet state in Mexico, an empire of Mexico with an Austrian aristocrat as the emperor, that had been defeated by Juarez. And in 1870, as the war really began, the first socialist party in history, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, created in the late 1860s, the followers of Marx, two men who would become important, August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, actively opposed in the Parliament of Prussia, voting for the funding of the war credits. They suffered repression for this. Others in the Socialist Party supported the war, but the First International actively opposed it. The policy of the First International was first to call for the French working class to remove the dictatorship of Napoleon III, and the German working class to oppose what was, from the perspective of the First International, a war of territorial expansion and aggression, to oppose territorial expansionism and join in general solidarity with the working class of France against the government of Otto von Bismarck, who saw the war, and he was successful in this, as a war to consolidate this new German empire, which was created out of the war. Okay, this war produced a revolutionary uprising in the city of Paris, the Paris Commune. Marx and members of the First International participated, not Marx personally, but supporters and members of the First International participated in the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune became, Marx would argue, not a socialist state. There were aspects of socialism in the Commune, but the first revolutionary worker state in history. It would be suppressed. It was attacked ultimately by everybody. Bismarck, fearful of the power of the German working class, actually captured French soldiers, large numbers of captured French soldiers. The French army had collapsed under Napoleon, and freed them to suppress the Commune. And Marx, out of this struggle, and even though the struggle would eventually lead to the breaking up, the divisions with the anarchists and others of the First International, which would leave London, reestablish its headquarters in New York. Nevertheless, Marx saw in this state the need to establish a worker state, a revolutionary worker state. And okay, I can continue now, if you wish, to look at the subsequent history. The concept has been established that the working class must fight against war. It must do, as Marx and others had written, everything through struggle, demonstrations, resistance to prevent war. And if war between nations takes place, it must struggle openly and actively to end the war as soon as possible, end the war without expansion of territory, conquest, etc. And although this would not be put forward so clearly in the parties of the Second International, to use, or not to use the war, but to struggle to develop a revolutionary consciousness among the working class in the midst of the war.
So to summarize, so far, we've got the American Civil War, which is taking place as the First International is being established, and they did take a strong stance in favor of supporting the Union, because that was, in Marx's eyes, this was protecting democracy, preventing slavery from expanding. Yeah. And then we also have Marx, on the one hand, supporting the Union in the American Civil War and also opposing the Franco-Prussian War. And then I do want to touch on this question that we identified. What did Marx and the International see when the war resulted in the Paris Commune?
They saw, Marx and the Marxists saw the Paris Commune as a positive development, a very positive development. Marx would be critical of the Commune's failure to defend itself more effectively militarily. He would be critical of some of the Commune's actions when it came to the question of the banks, but he looked positively at what the Commune had accomplished in terms of a democratic state, a state whose representatives would be chosen directly by the people, whose salaries would not be higher than that of the average worker, a state where the workers did and could take over the enterprises that had been abandoned by capitalists, a state in which the debts that the working class, which was faced with near starvation, had incurred were eliminated, where education was secularized, a whole series of revolutionary reforms, which the First International actively supported, and which had a significant component of socialism. But more importantly for Marx, this was a revolutionary worker state, not a state that the working class had through elections gained some influence.
Yes, okay, that's the distinction there.
Yes, that's the crucial distinction.
Big distinction there. The wars of conquest, these early imperialist wars, yeah. It was very important, and it still is pretty important to recognize that these are ruling class wars, and that the working class doesn't win either way.
Yes, no, the working class doesn't win. Its only way of winning will be through revolutionary struggle and successful revolutionary struggle. At least this was certainly what Marx and with Marx himself and activists of the First International came to see.
Yes. So let's talk about the First International a little bit and kind of how that was. We've kind of covered how that was formed, and it sounds like it was sort of a one big tent kind of idea,
Yes.
where they're trying to bring all these different factions together.
Yeah.
And so how long did that work out well, and when did we start seeing?
Well, it was always a small group. It was interesting that the First International was demonized by both the major European states and the capitalists. And for that matter, it came to be demonized in the United States. It was seen as having great power that it really never had. Its power was mostly advisory. And in the aftermath of the destruction of the Paris Commune, which lasted, and the Commune lasted weeks, in the aftermath of the destruction of the Paris Commune, the Pope, the leading, all of the European governments turned on the International. The support that the International had gotten from the British labor movement, which was the strongest labor movement in the world, the Trade Union Congress, it withdrew the financial support, and the International relocated to New York, and it formally went out of existence by the mid-1870s, although the working class kept on coming. Marx became more, not less, influential in the aftermath of the Paris Commune. His writing became much more widely known, and support among, not so much organized support, among the working classes and revolutionary intellectuals who would unite with the working classes, began to grow. The repression, the mass arrests in France by the late 1870s began to be lifted. There were amnesties, and the rights of workers to organize began to be reestablished. And by the 1880s, socialist parties, factionalized in France, rival parties, came into existence, roughly as Marx himself. At the time that Marx himself passed away, in the late 1870s, there was even a long and fascinating interview in the Chicago Tribune, one of the leading newspapers of the United States, and not a newspaper representing working class policies, with Karl Marx. So Marx was widely known, and the International, while it ceased to exist, socialist parties and trade union movements began to grow and take shape.
So then there was a brief period of time between when the First International was dissolved and the forming of the Second International.
About the Second International would be formed after 1890. So it's about 15 years. But socialist parties are coming into existence. Marx and Engels criticize what is the largest socialist party in the world, the German Social Democratic Party, when they come forward with a reformist program, the so-called Gotha program, in the late 1870s. And there, Marx puts forward the idea, the necessity of a revolutionary worker state as against reformism and elections. A revolutionary worker state, the term is dictatorship of the proletariat, but the word dictatorship had a different meaning, and this is very important in the 19th century. All states are essentially dictatorships. Dictatorships mean empowerment and sovereign rule. Marx saw a worker state, a proletarian state, a dictatorship of the proletariat as representing a higher level of democracy, a much higher level of democracy than the existing capitalist states. Capitalist states, some capitalist states, European capitalist states, the American capitalist state had democratic forms, capitalist or bourgeois democratic forms. However, those democratic forms did not exist in other states, like the emerging Tsarist Russian Empire, which was semi-feudal. Those democratic forms did not exist in China. They did not exist in British colonial empire. India, they did not exist in most of the world, And as imperialism expanded, these democratic states and these democratic structures were being undermined in the countries where they existed, the advanced or industrialized capitalist countries, in large part because of the militarism that imperialism demanded. Okay, I hope that's not a long tangent.
No, that's great. That's perfect.
Okay.
I think that it's important to understand this history, and there's so much to it. There's so many layers.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Now, the Second International, and this is an important example, I think, or the Second International really begins events that lead to the Second International in 1889, the 100th anniversary of the beginnings of the French Revolution. Workers' organizations and socialist organizations meet in Paris, and they decide to hold demonstrations on May 1st, 1890, calling for the 8-hour day, calling for campaigns on the part of governments. And this is a time when workers in the United States are working 60, 70-hour weeks, 6-day weeks, 12-hour, 10-hour, and 12-hour days, and conditions similar, if not worse, in other countries. And the reason they choose May 1st is that this will be the 4th anniversary of the Knights of Labor in the United States, and what was an anarchist-based labor organization calling for demonstrations for an 8-hour day, leading to the Haymarket Massacre and the arrest of the leaders of the demonstration, their execution, and them becoming martyrs to an international labor movement. This taking place in the United States. So the United States played a role in setting the stage for what became the Second International. Mass parties developed with the Second International, large parties. The German Social Democratic Party is the most important of these mass parties. The Second International develops a strategy. Marxism is the most important force or ideological force in the Second International. The strategy is to build trade unions, build socialist parties, have the socialist parties advance legislation, providing for workers' rights, workers' democracy, including the right to vote, which workers did not have in many places, workers' rights, workers' democracy, eliminating anti-labor laws, and the unions, as they grew, supporting the existing socialist party. These two arms of the workers' movement, the socialist parties and the trade union movement, would join hands together, and they would eventually create working class majorities that would establish socialism. But how would this be done? Because in this period, imperialism was becoming a greater factor. Militarization of the major imperialist powers, the major powers, was becoming more, not less, of a factor. Africa was carved up by the major European powers and some not so major European powers. Portugal, for example. Millions of people were murdered in the Congo in what was the first genocide, when it was essentially a feudal fiefdom of King Leopold at the end of the 19th century. The crimes of imperialism led to more and more wars, and the question of what the Second International would do, what policy it would take to deal with imperialism, this was a crucial question that the Second International, there were even some who argued, not Marxists so much, that imperialism was not a bad thing in and of itself because it would enable socialist ideas and socialist principles to advance in the colonies. Marx, or rather the leader of a wing of the Russian Marxist movement, Vladimir Lenin, and a German socialist who had been part of the Russian, who had left, Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, began to challenge these views and sought to revive, and did revive, beginning as early as 1908, a call for the Second International that wasn't listened to, a call for the Second International to actively oppose imperialist wars. And this is the resolution that Lenin and Luxemburg, this is 1907, at the 7th Congress of the Second International, that they came forward with. Wars between capitalist states, as a rule, are the result of the battle for world markets, with each state seeking to secure its markets, but to conquer new ones. Wars are favored by the national prejudices, which are systematically cultivated among peoples in the interests of their ruling classes for the purpose of distracting the proletarian masses from their own class duties, as well as from their duties of international solidarity. Wars, part of the very nature of capitalism. They will only cease when the capitalist system is abolished. And the final points. In case of war breaking out, it is the duty for the working class to intervene in its speedy termination and with all their powers to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and therefore hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. Also, the resolution called, and this was not carried forward, the duty of the working classes and their representatives, parliamentary representatives. And now there were in France, in Germany, in Italy, with the new British Labour Party in England, significant numbers of parliamentary representatives, supported by the coordinating activity of the International Socialist Bureau to exert every effort to prevent the outbreak of the war. The resolution ultimately null and void. In 1914, as World War I broke out, an imperialist war, clearly the major socialist parties in France and Germany voted war credits for the war and supported the war. Italy would enter the war a year later, and there the Italian Socialist Party, having time to watch what was happening, did not support the war. But the major European powers did support the war. The United States would enter the war 3 years later. The Socialist Party of the United States, which was a factor, but in no way had the support of the European parties in terms of mass support, would also oppose the war. Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and others actively opposed the war. In Tsarist Russia, largely underground Marxist parties, there were two, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The majority of the Mensheviks supported the war. Other left groups split. Lenin's Bolsheviks actively opposed the war. And as the war went on, whose writings would become the basis of the communist wing, world socialist movement, major principles, foundational elements that came to be Marxism-Leninism, the idea of a revolutionary workers' party, a vanguard party, Lenin called it, which would organize a party of advanced workers and revolutionary intellectuals, not necessarily a mass party as such, but a party of advanced workers and revolutionary intellectuals, educate, organize, and coordinate the struggles of the working class, a party organized on the basis of democratic centralism, every grouping from the club to the district to the higher levels of the National Committee or the Central Committee and then the Political Bureau would be elected from above, but where factionalism, which had devastated people's movements, would be prevented. Individuals would either accept the decisions made at the various levels or resign from the party. The Revolutionary Vanguard Party, the concept that Lenin would advance in State and Revolution, reviving and enriching Marx's views derived from the Paris Commune and from his criticisms, the German Social Democrats, the criticisms of the Gotha program in the late 1870s in State and Revolution, not of simply having majorities that would take over the existing capitalist state, or as the anarchists argued at the time, smashing the state, eliminating all government, and establishing voluntary collectives, but establishing a new state, a revolutionary worker state. And then the third principle, which was connected to the first two, Lenin's concept of the new imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in which Lenin argued imperialism, the new imperialism of industrial finance capital, created a new situation where capital itself was being exported into the colonial regions, a situation where raw materials, markets, and labor as a commodity were now being fought over by the major with no limits. The world was being redefined or redivided. And these new alliances, like the great monopolies, the cartels in Europe, the trusts in the United States, were unstable. They were centered by the alliance of bank and brokerage capital. In the United States, the two great syndicates were led by Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. And they were unstable, they were ferocious, they were fighting with each other, and they were in the process of destroying existing liberal bourgeois democracy through more and more militarization, more and more wars, much bigger wars, of which World War I was the example. And now it was the duty of the socialist movement, and Lenin carried this forward in the revolution, the successful Soviet revolution. And the Soviets were seen as the foundation for a new revolutionary worker state to actively oppose imperialism, the principle of the rights of national self-determination, central to the struggle of the working classes, and to actively oppose something that the Second International had not done at all, actively oppose imperialism in the colonial and semi-colonial regions of the world, anti-imperialist movements, fronts, coalitions within these countries, and also struggle to build socialist movements and parties within these countries. And the new international, the third international, referred to as the Communist International or Comintern, would begin to do with its conditions, its 21 conditions for membership. When it came into existence in 1919, in the midst of this bloody civil war in which over 500,000 troops, including 15,000 Americans, relatively small number compared to what the Japanese, the British, the French, and the other European powers threw in, sought to defeat the revolution. Okay, now we can move forward. Okay, you have any questions?
Wow, so this...
Wow is right. Okay, I'll give you a lot of theory.
The Second International really had an opportunity that you use words like they refused to, and they didn't take a stance against imperialist war.
No, they, to use an expression that we all know, they blew it. And the reason they blew it, in part, was they had no larger revolutionary strategy, period. They developed their own bureaucratic structures, their own mass organizations that would copy that of capitalist organizations. They developed, in some respects, a vested interest in the existing system. They believed that as they grew stronger and stronger, they would be able to establish socialism. It would fall into their laps like an apple, a Newtonian theory. And there were those who began to argue then, Edward Bernstein was the most important figure, that socialism was evolving and one would have to get away from Marxist theories generally and simply fight for reforms, period. The majority of the Second International continue to identify themselves as Marxists, and they continue to quote Marx and identify with Marx. But beyond the strategy of building parties and building unions, they had no larger revolutionary strategy and plan and program. And they simply avoided developing beyond fighting for peace. And they did. I mean, they did. Before World War I, the socialist parties of Europe organized the biggest peace demonstrations in history in France, in Germany, throughout Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people engaged in peace demonstrations. But when the war was declared, the major parties supported their nations. Lenin would say they supported their nations on the basis of defensism, and some, like the liberals in the United States who listened to Woodrow Wilson, or who believed Woodrow Wilson's call a war to make the world safe for democracy, a war that would be a peace without victory, which was, to put it mildly, all very much BS. They believed they picked up on those kinds of slogans and tried to argue that the victory of their nation in the war would be a victory for the working class, which of course it wasn't going to be. But as the war went on, and the reality of the war, not only the death and destruction, the reality of the war, meaning that the forces of mass production were now being used for mass destruction, oppression, militarization, the destruction of workers' rights, opposition grew and grew among the working classes. And a potential revolutionary situation existed, and there were uprisings, which were suppressed after the war. And of course, the reaction to the Soviet revolution, and was not only the creation of the Comintern, the creation of communist parties, but the great backlash, imperialism in its most brutal, savage form, fascism, the successful fascist seizure of power, first in Italy, and the later, with the development of fascist movements, supported by sections of the capitalist class, reactionary sections of the capitalist class, but in general, supported by the capitalist class, first as a kind of insurance policy against socialist revolutions, and as a way to keep socialist parties down, but then actively supported when they seized power in carrying forward the kinds of repression, terror, and murder that the imperialist powers have been carrying forward in Africa, for example, in Europe itself. And the question of the Communist International, the Comintern, with its principle of proletarian internationalism, building parties, and the Comintern made many mistakes in the 1920s and 1930s. We really don't have time to go into the mistakes in response to the failures of the Second International, because the Second International was ineffective in developing central policies. Third International, or Comintern, was, if anything, over-centralized, while the various commissions of the Comintern wrote up policies for the various nations and regions based on the representatives of those nations and regions on the commissions. The Soviets were not simply calling the shots. This is capitalist propaganda, and it can be shown to be false. Directives from the Comintern were carried forward in ways, in China, for example, that would have destructive effects in the late 1920s. A united front between the nationalist Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China, which was growing very significantly, once the leader of the nationalist Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen, who was socialist-oriented and progressive, once he died, his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, in 1927, the alliance following victories against the warlords and launched a campaign of terror and murder, a civil war against the Communist Party of China. There were other major defeats. The Comintern, faced with depression, called upon communist parties to fight to build united fronts from below, not to unite with social democratic parties. And in Germany, this policy of struggling with the Social Democrats at a time that the combined strength of the Social Democrats and the communists was greater than the Nazi Party, was a factor. It was one of the factors, but a factor creating the situation where the Nazi Party, supported by big German capital, would seize power and establish an imperialist, racist dictatorship that would launch a policy of imperialist expansion, not only globally, but in Europe itself.
So Lenin comes along, and then Lenin's writings and Lenin's understanding become influential.
Influential. It's the basis for the communist wing of the movement, for the Third International. And then, of course, you have fascism. And the question is, what is to be done? What is to be done to fight fascism? And here, with communist parties in France and in the United States, Earl Browder's leadership here, communists begin to fight for, after Hitler's victory in Germany, the attempts by fascists in France in 1934, using a political crisis involving a Jewish financier, a Russian Jewish financier named Stavisky, to launch anti-government, anti-Semitic riots and establish their own dictatorship. The socialist and communist parties come together, and there's a powerful communist party in France, to unite against the fascist leagues. Then in 1935, at the 7th Congress of the Comintern comes forward with a program against fascism and war, a redefinition of proletarian internationalism to build united fronts and people's fronts, alliances, center-left alliances to fight fascism in the major European countries and through the world. This united front policy, this people's front policy, is articulated by the General Secretary of the Comintern, Georgy Dimitrov, and he begins to call upon the communist parties to actively involve themselves, not in what he called self-satisfied sectarianism, not in endless theoretical debates and with each other, but in active struggles to learn from the masses of people, to respond seriously to their interests, to their feelings, realizing that fascists faced with this economic crisis are appealing to middle strata and workers, promising to solve their problems, promising to eliminate unemployment, blaming minorities, blaming foreign powers for all of their problems, the way Donald Trump blamed Mexicans, blamed Muslims, blamed the existing government for all of the problems that the people faced, and advocating violent militaristic solutions, that you've got to confront these groups, oppose them actively, as the existing capitalist governments hadn't, and as even governments where social democrats had been influential, had not done. And this united front policy, this people's front policy, leads to the victory in 1936 of a government, a People's Front government, supported by the Communist Party of Spain, of socialists, liberals, and communists. And in response to that People's Front government in 1936, a fascist coup, a military coup, led by a right-wing general, Francisco Franco, is beaten back. The workers organize, they form barricades, they push back the coup makers. Franco then turns to fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, who pour in supplies, weapons, later troops, the Germans particularly, air power, to support his counter-revolutionary army. The major European powers do not take a position of, quote, neutrality and oppose any aid to the Spanish Republic. The Soviets and the Comintern then come forward with a policy of actively supporting the Republic, the Spanish Republic, as Marx had supported the American Republic.
Mm-hmm.
Here, the situation is very different, though. Over close to 50,000 volunteers, including nearly 3,000 Americans, organized brigades to fight with and for the Republic in this civil war. The Soviet Union becomes the only nation to provide aid, even though its level of economic development is such that the aid that it does provide is nowhere near as great as the aid that Nazi Germany and fascist Italy are providing to Franco's fascist forces, to the Spanish Republic. And in the context of the Spanish Civil War, proletarian internationalism is advanced in the struggle, although it's to be unsuccessful, to save the Republic. However, in World War II, the idea of this People's Front approach to fighting fascism in the resistance movements, in the partisan movements, would play an important role in the eventual defeat of fascism. In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union comes forward in the League of Nations, which it had joined. And the nations of the League are capitalist nations, overwhelmingly. Generally, they're capitalist nations. The Soviet Union is the only socialist nation, calling for collective security, namely that the nations of Europe commit themselves to take joint action to prevent any act of military aggression. This too fails as policy. The European nations support a policy of appeasement. Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, particularly Nazi Germany. In France, a Popular Front government is elected. In 1936 also, its leader, Léon Blum, does initially fight to advance a policy in defense of the Spanish Republic, but French capital is strong enough to block this. The major capitalist powers taking the position better Nazi Germany than the Soviet Union, taking the position that opposition to the Soviets, continuing the policy of quarantining the Soviet revolution and preventing socialist and communist revolutions and movements from growing strong in Europe is the first priority. And if anything, turning Nazi Germany into using it to invade and destroy the Soviet Union, that this is the first priority. And it's under those conditions that World War II takes place. And since the major European powers are not able or willing really to fight the war, they don't expect the war. The Soviets, faced with this reality, faced with defeat in Spain, faced with the abandonment of the carving up of Czechoslovakia at the so-called Munich Agreement, to protect themselves, sign a non-aggression pact in 1939 with Nazi Germany. They are playing for time. They know they're playing for time. They don't trust Hitler. They know what Hitler has done with other non-aggression pacts. He had one with Poland and tore it up. And it's in this context that World War II begins. Unlike World War I, where the French army defended France from Germany and defended Paris from Germany, the French army collapses. The fear of revolution and the fear of socialism and communism and the hostility to socialism and communism is such that the path is open for Nazi Germany to gain control of Western and Central Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union, though, changes everything. The Soviets, in alliance with the British Empire and the United States, would play the central role, the leading role, in winning the war, a war that would cost in Europe and Asia over 70 million lives and nearly 27 million dead in the Soviet Union, the greatest war in human history. And out of that war would come a world revolutionary situation, the collapse of imperialism, the defeat of fascism, the collapse of colonialism. And out of that war, too, would eventually become the world that we lived in, namely a world in which the United States inherited both the assets and the liabilities of all the former imperialist states, ally and enemy. And the United States actively repressed its own Marxist and communist left, not the United States, not the American people, but the US government carried out far-reaching purges, far-reaching political repression directed against not only communists, but those who opposed its developing Cold War policy. And the Cold War policy became a policy of military alliances through the whole world and a situation where the United States, which had not had a colonial empire before World War II, highest military budget before the war had been $1 billion, would now spend trillions in the decades to come to establish military bases in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and military commitments through the NATO alliance and other alliance systems, the defense of, quote, capitalism in the world. Okay, what happens to Proletarian Internationalism? Okay, well, we have gone for a very long time. Maybe we should I'm trying to think of how we can do this best. Do you have any questions right now?
No, I mean, I think that this history here where the World War II is going on and, the US is allied with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And then immediately the Cold War begins. The Cold War is going on even, before the dust is settled.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating period that, honestly, we could probably do a whole episode just on.
Yeah. Well, Franklin Roosevelt dies. His program for an economic Bill of Rights, a second Bill of Rights, which had aspects of socialism within it, is never to be enacted. Roosevelt and his vice president, who is to be ousted in 1944 at the Democratic National Convention and replaced with Harry Truman, who is not a supporter of these policies, also called for the building of the United Nations as an institution to advance peace and prevent reaction and fascism, for the revival of reaction and fascism in the world. The United Nations initially is not only committed to the rehabilitation of war-torn countries, but Roosevelt comes forward with advocates plans for regional systems, not military alliances, but regional organizations connected to general economic development that would, over time, eliminate the inequalities and the divisions that had produced war. And all of that pretty much goes by the wayside. Truman's policies from the beginning, and this is greatly strengthened by the development of the atomic bomb, is to see the Soviets as an enemy, force the Soviets out of Eastern Europe as much as that can be done. The Soviets do not begin to, in effect, use their power as they occupy Eastern Europe, and they define this as an expression of proletarian internationalism to establish in Eastern Europe governments organized on their model, the Soviet model of socialism. And they call this an expression, people's democracies, they call these governments. And they organize these governments on the basis of the Soviet model. And just as the US creates the NATO alliance and uses the NATO alliance and uses the earlier Truman Doctrine, the US commits itself to a policy of actively opposing any attempts by armed minorities, revolutionary movements, or outside pressure, meaning the Soviet Union, to overturn governments that the United States supports. The United States intervenes, replacing Britain in the civil war in Greece, and successfully defeats communist-led revolutionary insurgents in Greece. NATO is created at a time when there are very large and influential communist parties in both France and Italy, to tie these countries into a military alliance, and also to block any influence as far as possible of the Soviet Union in Europe and anywhere else. Turkey which is not a democratic state and not part of Western Europe, is brought into the NATO alliance. And the Soviets respond by the mid-1950s in the name now what they call socialist internationalism. They're still talking about proletarian internationalism, developing their own military alliance system, the Warsaw Treaty Alliance, the East European countries that they call People's Democracy. And of course, the Soviets now have an atomic bomb, and a nuclear arms race is crucial to what is happening. A nuclear arms race that creates, by the early 1960s, nuclear overkill, meaning that on paper, the Soviet Union and the United States have so many nuclear weapons that, and this is a mathematical, theoretical, they have the power to wipe out the human race, literally to wipe out the human race. In this period also, faced with the Chinese Socialist Revolution in the late 1940s, the US aids Chiang Kai-shek's regime to the tune of $3 billion in military aid, then prevents the reunification of China that everybody expected by sending the US Navy into the Formosa Strait, aiding Chiang Kai-shek, establishing, quote, a Republic of China on the Chinese island of Taiwan, which had been a Japanese colony, the 1890s to the end of World War II. And the United States enters and fights in the Korean War, which leads to over 3 million Korean dead and enormous devastation through bombing, and a divided Korea. Korea had been divided into Soviet and American zones at the end of World War II. And then, of course, in the aftermath of this, the US also begins to create, even with all the devastation in Korea and destruction in Korea, a similar state in South Vietnam against what was a communist-led national liberation movement under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, which had the support of the masses of people. And the US knew through the CIA that if elections were held in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and the communist-led Viet Minh would win. in 1954-55. So no elections were held, and the South Vietnamese government was established, and eventually faced with defeat, military defeat. There was massive U.S. escalation in that war, and the effects of all of this, by the way, for the United States. And I've written a long article on this in the Encyclopedia, the History of Imperialism, Anti-Imperialism, a long article. I wrote it a number of years ago on the social costs of imperialism for the United States. The effect of the early Cold War, launched by Truman, was to prevent the enactment of national health insurance, free tuition, higher public education, a national housing policy, a national full employment policy, the programs that Roosevelt had come forward with at the end of the war, and that the Democrats had run on in electing Truman in 1948, the New Deal and Fair Deal programs. The Cold War and the Korean War killed those programs by associating them with what was denounced as creeping socialism. The Great Society programs of the Johnson administration and the war on poverty that Johnson had called for, and which did lead to Medicare and an expansion of particularly education and other programs and environmental protection, all of that largely crippled by the Vietnam War expansion. And ultimately, Okay, we have gone a very long way.
Yes.
Okay, let me say it's a little difficult to wrap this up or try to even think of wrapping this up, but other issues developed in this period that would influence greatly working class internationalism. The division between the Soviet Union and China was used, undermined proletarian internationalism in the larger sense. We can't go into that division. It's complicated. China saw the Soviet Union, and they had some legitimate points here, very legitimate points, as committing themselves through their definition of socialist internationalism to a policy of actively supporting their own bloc, basically engaging in a kind of socialist imperialism, supporting their own bloc, moving away from proletarian internationalism, moving away from actively supporting the liberation struggles of the peoples of the Third World. And they broke with the Soviets. This conflict intensified over the years. The defeat of US-led imperialism in Vietnam resulted in not only a devastated Vietnam, a powerful anti-war movement in the United States, but the long period of economic expansion from World War II to the 1970s, in the late 1970s, and an offensive by capitalism against the gains that the working class had made was then carried forward. The Soviet Union found itself with a system that was rigid and increasingly unable to change. The Soviets had found themselves also in a global arms race with the United States, with much weaker allies, but also as this economic crisis, while the United States was in many ways losing to countries like Japan in terms of advanced industry and other areas, the Soviets were being hurt more, not less. Military spending, keeping up with the US, had harmed their economy more. And their lack of, in a sense, like they were in a situation similar to the Second International, they had no real strategy to advance socialism, to advance revolution. They were marking time. In the 1980s, a leadership that was, in reality, I would say, right-wing revisionist under Mikhail Gorbachev, began to abandon the core principles of Marxism-Leninism, proletarian internationalism being one, and began, in effect, to set the stage, the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, abandoning in 1989, 1990, the Soviets' allies in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia and East Germany being the most important ones, and then really redefining the Soviet Union itself and being overthrown, a counter-revolution. Once that counter-revolution succeeded and the Soviet Union was dismembered, the major capitalist countries, a little bit like the end of the wars of the French Revolution in 1815 and the creation of the Holy Alliance in Europe, believed that they had won. They had ended history. The Holy Alliance believed they had ended the Enlightenment. They had ended the 17th and 18th century. They had destroyed republicanism. They had destroyed democracy. They were wrong. They were very wrong. The equivalent of the Holy Alliance, with the United States playing the leading role, believed that capitalism and their definitions of liberty and freedom would control the world. Democracy, their definition of democracy, was now dominant. Socialism was buried. It was finished. The leaders of the Holy Alliance forgot about the American Republic in 1815, which would continue to develop with all of its contradictions. And the leaders of the US-NATO alliance, among other things, about the People's Republic of China, which has developed and struggled to develop with greater and greater success a new model of socialism, and a model of socialism based on mixed economy, in which the private sector works to benefit the public sector, not vice versa, and has actively opposed aggressive US imperialism and the US NATO bloc. I thought I would end this presentation, and we can talk about the various wars, the dangers of these wars. The divisions between the major capitalist powers haven't gone away. They haven't gone away at all. The US has continued aggressively under Bush, particularly under Bush II, to invade and occupy Iraq against its German and French allies. The recent Ukraine war has had the effect so far of strengthening the US-NATO bloc, of strengthening unilateralism, which had been weakened and undermined. But I don't think it's going to last. I thought I would end with this recent peace proposal by the People's Republic of China on Ukraine, which reminds me of the proposals that the United States had come forward with at the end of World War II for the United Nations, a kind of general peace proposal. It's in the form of 12, I think it should be read and should be read widely. It hasn't been dealt with in American media, and it's more than just a settlement for the Ukraine. Point 1. Respect the sovereignty of all countries. Recognize international law, including the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Abandon the Cold War mentality. Quote, the security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. Ceasing hostilities. Conflict and war benefits no one. Resuming peace talks. Dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis and to all other crises. Resolving the humanitarian crisis. All measures conducive to easing the humanitarian crisis, meaning the destruction, poverty, the safety of civilians must be effectively protected, and humanitarian corridors set up for the evacuation of civilians from conflict zones. The UN should be supported in playing a coordinating role in channeling humanitarian aid. Again, it's the central role of the United Nations. Protect civilians and prisoners of war. Keep nuclear power plants safe. Nuclear weapons should not be used, and the threat of nuclear weapons should be opposed. Specifically, was stop unilateral sanctions, industrial supply chain stable, and promote post-conflict reconstruction, which the United Nations did. This is a peace program in the spirit of both proletarian internationalism, working class internationalism in the best sense, and it comes from the major power of socialism, developing a new model of socialism which hopefully succeed in the world today. Okay, I think that's a decent way to end where we are today. The Biden administration hopefully will not follow in the path of Harry Truman after World War II and Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. Not that it's come forward with a major progressive program, but given what has happened in the United States, given the dangers that the Trump presidency and what is widely regarded, and rightly so, as neo-fascism in America represents. A policy on the part of the Trump administration actively supporting this third Cold War in both Europe and also in China, against China, in terms of Taiwan, Japan, and other Asian countries, can only have catastrophic consequences, given the US economy and given the political dangers. Food for thought, Kyle. Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, this is a lot of really important stuff. And I think ending with peace proposal, those 12 points, is perfect. And I'm with you. I want to be optimistic that it will succeed. And I mean, that's all we can do. We have to, we can't fall into just complete cynicism. And
No. Defeatism only leads to defeat. We can struggle and realistically, but this is from the Chinese revolutionary leader Mao Zedong. It's my favorite agitational slogan of all time. Unite the many, defeat the few, dare to struggle, dare to win. Unite the many, defeat the few. That's our mission. Dare to struggle. That's our hope. We may not win, but that's our hope.
And we can learn from history. And this is why discussions like this are so important, because we can see from struggles of the past where things can go wrong and where to make corrections.
100% right.
Well, Norman, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you asking me, Kyle, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.